Today's daf is Eruvin Ayin Chet. Okay, we started yesterday with, or really a bit in the Mishnah before, about when there's courtyards next to each other. Our main topic is two courtyards with a wall in between. And the question is, what's going to be considered that they have either access to each other, which if they have access to each other, that means that you can both climb the wall and get down the other side. When there's access for both sides, then we can say they can make an Eruv together. And when there's access only from one side, then the issue becomes, and the issue is this way in both issues, which is if there's access, then if the wall is 10 tefachim high, generally we say the wall becomes its own space and then one can't use the space depending on whether it's Reshut Yachid or not. But there's an issue of can you carry items up to there or not? And then we said the issue becomes if you can make it shorter, then we're going to call this is accessible to you. Remember, even though we said 10 tefachim is not very high, still they viewed it as somewhat inaccessible. And therefore, once it's inaccessible, well, then you don't have use of the wall. You can't carry items up to the wall if you want it. Once you say it's lower, then it means that the wall is usable to you, and then you can actually use it and bring items up and down. It means, of course, if you haven't done an Eruv, you can't bring them up to the wall and down the other side, but you can bring items up to the wall and back down. So now we're going to continue with different cases like that. We're going to start at the last line of Ayin Zayin Amud Bet. Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Bar Ravua. Ziz hayotzei min hakotel arba'a al arba'a. If you remember yesterday, we kept saying 4 tefachim is the width. And there was a debate between Rashi and Tosa whether it's 4 or 4 by 4. Here they specifically say 4 by 4, but it doesn't really help us because not everyone has this version that says 4 by 4. And in fact, you're going to see the picture. The picture shows it actually as 4. And not 4 by 4. So let me pull up the picture for a second. But you're going to see the picture for some reason, I don't know why, but the picture, I guess, just goes by the version that the Gemara doesn't say 4 by 4 and really just 4. So we have a ziz. What's a ziz? A ziz is something that juts out of the wall. Okay, here you see like a wooden beam that's attached to the wall. Now, a wooden beam attached to the wall, we ended with this yesterday about the itztiba. Remember, we had itztiba, gabe itztiba. Itztiba was kind of the same thing as the ziz. And there we said it has to be 4 or right within 3 tefachim of the ground. Or if there's one that's within 3 tefachim of the one that's within 3 tefachim of the ground, as long as it's all within 3 tefachim, we can get from one to the other. So here we have a ziz that's coming out of the wall, but it's higher. It's 4 by 4, or 4 wide, but it's higher than we need. And it's, now imagine you have something in the wall at a certain height. You're not going to be able to climb up to there. It's not so convenient to climb. So basically, the Gemara is going to say, if it's sulam koshehu miato, as long as you put some sort of ladder that gets you up to there, then it's totally fine. Then we can say this means, again, what does it mean, lema'et? It means that we view this wall as if the wall is shorter than it is because we can get to the wall very easily. But lo amaran, but this they only said, by the way, ela de otveale. That's if the ladder, okay, this is the right side, where the ladder goes straight up to the top. Aval otve bahadeh, but if you placed the ladder next to the ziz, where it doesn't get straight to the ziz, but it's next to it, arvuche aruche. All you've done really is mean that the ziz is a bit wider than it was, but you don't really, it's not really accessible. Okay, arvuche means you basically, now it looks like the ziz is wider than it is because there's also something up alongside it next to it. But it doesn't actually make the ziz accessible because you wouldn't really climb up the ladder and then go onto something that's on the side. It's not so comfortable. Think about it. When you put a ladder up, you put the ladder directly to where you want to climb to. You don't put it next to the spot where you want to get to, although one could claim, depending on how next to it is. I would imagine this would have to be a little bit farther away. In the picture, they show it right next to. But anyway, it's a question. I think that you still, the way the picture shows that you theoretically would maybe climb on the ladder and then climb over next to it. But again, I think they're just saying it's much more accessible. Here it just looks like you're putting up a ladder for some other reason. Whereas if it's leading directly to it, then it's clear that it's in order to get to the ziz. Okay, another thing he says. Kotel tisha asal. This was all, until now, we've been mainly talking about your kotel was 10 tefachim high, and you want to have something that basically cuts the height of the 10. But what if your kotel, your wall is tisha asar, it's 19 handbreadths. Tzarich ziz echad lahatiro. So one ziz is enough, but you have to put the ziz right in the middle. You have to put it where there's less than 10 leading up to it, and less than 10 from the Z's to the top. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a space of 10 tvachim that's inaccessible, and then you're going to have a full-fledged wall. So it would have to have you would have to have one Z's in the middle, right in the center. But kotel islim, but let's say, okay, I'm now moving to picture 261. Let's say you have a wall that's 20 tvachim high. At this point, if you put a Z's right in the middle, it's not going to cut it because it's 10 to get there and it's 10 from there. That's already 10. So you need shnei zizim lahatiro. You need 2. And comes Rav Chisda and he says, and you can see the picture, Rav Chisda, v'hu sheha'emidan zeh shelo keneged zeh. They can't be opposite each other. They can't be one under the other. They have to be at different spots so that the assumption here, and we're going to see this later on, is that your ladders need to be angled in order to make it comfortable for you to walk in it, right? And generally, you don't put a ladder straight up. It's not so stable that way. In order to stabilize a ladder, especially if they're not like our ladders, which have a whole piece that stabilizes it, and even ours, right? We generally use them, unless you have a fancy one, we generally don't go straight up, we angle them. So because they have to be angled, it would have to be that the 2 zizim that you put to cut this 20 tvachim are separate from each other. Okay, so that you can get from one to the other. Okay, Amar Rav Huna. Amud, just one second. Amud, if the wall is 20, I just want to look at the question. Wouldn't the bottom of the Z's be slightly below 10? Right, so I was thinking about that if you have 20, it's a good question. Then you end up with, the Z's takes up some space. But I think still they assume you're only getting to the top of the Z's. So basically, if the top of the Z's is right at 10, then you basically have 10 inaccessible below and 10 inaccessible above. If I understood your question, that's what I think you would have to say. Amar Rav Huna. Now we're moving to the next picture. Now we're actually moving off of Eruv Chatzerot for a minute. You can see from the picture, 262, we're no longer in the realm of Eruv Chatzerot because right now the picture is in the middle of a big Reshut HaRabim. And you have a beam in the middle. The beam is Amud b'Reshut HaRabim, Gavoa 10 v'Rachav 4. We're now dealing with, okay, we've gotten off topic, but the similarity is going to be Lima'et. Okay, this picture, by the way, doesn't exactly show what we want yet, but it's a more advanced case of what we're going to discuss. That's why I'm already showing it to you. Here's this tan colored beam. Okay, it's in the middle of Reshut HaRabim. The question is, if we have something on top of it, does that, again, the words lima'et, does it take something that's 10 tvachim tall and view it as if it's lower? Now, what's the relevance? The relevance is different, but the idea is the same, that if we somehow can say that this space isn't usable anymore, or right, in our case, it's more accessible, right? Because our spaces, we want to be able to say there's no barrier between us. Here, we have something in Reshut HaRabim. This beam has the qualities of a Reshut Yachid, so it's considered a private domain because it's 10 tvachim high, 4 by 4 tvachim wide. Okay, that's this Amud b'Reshut HaRabim Gavoa 10 v'Rachav 4. So it's called a Reshut Yachid. Now, if we can lima'et and say this really isn't as big as we think it is because it's got something bothering it, which we're going to get to in a minute, then what's it going to be? Well, anything that's 4 by 4, right? If it's in the middle of Reshut HaRabim and it now has it's less than 4 by 4 wide, then what are we going to say? This is now going to be called a makom p'tur. Okay, remember, an exempt space. And then if you're in the public domain and you want to put something on here, you can, because it's a makom p'tur, not a Reshut Yachid. If it's a Reshut Yachid, then you're obligated midoraita for moving something from public to private. So what happens if na'atz bo? So that's why lima'et is very significant here. It's not at all the same ramifications as for our case, but it's the same idea that maybe something could cause something to be considered less than it is. So let's say it's 10 high, 4 wide. V'na'atz bo yated koshu. Now in this picture, you see a lot of yatedot, okay? Pegs that are, or something that's in there. So, but imagine this picture without all the pegs, with just one peg. So do we say, if I put any kind of peg, it doesn't matter how high, miato, according to Rav Huna, that already means I can't use the 4 by 4 space on the top here. I can use less than 4 by 4 because I have something stuck in my way. So I can't put something down on top of this whole space. If I wanted to lay something down here, I'd have to lay it on the side of the yated. That means already I don't have 4 by 4. So if that's the case, it's a makom p'tur, it's miato. But not everybody agrees with this. Because he says kol shehu, anything, any size. Amar Rav Ada bar Ava, we're going to see a bunch of different opinions here. Ubegova shlosha, he says it has to be a height of 3. Why? So 2 possible answers. One is our classic, anything under 3 we call levud. So we view it, now generally we don't use levud in this way, and that's why I'm not sure it's 100% levud, but it's as if it's not there. Okay, we view it as if, like if you have something off the ground that's within 3 of the ground, we kind of view it as if it's attached to the ground. So the truth is, you would use levud this way. It's just not on the ground, right? You would say it's as if it's really not here. Otherwise, you could say maybe just anything, the measurement of 3 tvachim is a measurement of significance. Anything less than that is not significant at all. So it doesn't really bother us. Okay, so he says, unless it's 3, it's not going to get in our way. Abai ve'amra, ve'rava de'amre travayu, they go back to what Rav Huna said. No, it doesn't matter what height it is. Why? Because we have to look at what is this doing for us. My time, it doesn't matter how high it is. The fact is you're not going to be able to use the top of this. If you want to put something down, that thing jutting out is in the way. It doesn't matter how high it juts out. It's in our way and we can't use it. If it's not usable space, then it's not a 4x4 of usable space. Then it's considered an exempt space. Rav Ashi has a different opinion. He says, afilu shegavoa shlosha. My taima, he says, forget less than 3. I think even more than 3, it's still a reshut yachid. Okay, he goes the other extreme. My taima, efshar netalia be'midi. You can hang something on it. Okay, this yated is usable for you. So now you have a space that's 4x4. That some of it is usable to put down an object, let's say, and some of it is usable to hang something on. So basically the entire space is usable. It's just each part may be usable in a different way, but it's all usable for you, which means this is called a reshut yachid, no matter what. Okay, so we saw all a range of 3 different opinions here. Now they're going to ask a question on Rav Ashi's opinion. Now we'll finally get to what this picture shows. So I understand you want to hang something on it, it's usable. What if the entire thing is covered with yetedot? Now at this point, first of all, I guess, number one, you can't really use the space underneath because there's very little space to actually use. So all you really have is the space where the yetedot are. They don't cover the entire space. Or maybe you would just say it's very hard to hang things if you have a whole bunch of pegs there. So either which way, this is much less usable. What would you say in this case? So Amarle, Rabbi Ashi says to him, Lo shmi alach, we saw this the other day. What, you didn't hear? You don't know this halacha? Hada Amar Rabbi Yochanan, moving to picture number 263. Bor b'chuliyata mitzaref la'asara. Let's say we learned already that if you have a tail, a mound of dirt, that's 10 tvachim high and 4x4 wide, that's considered reshut yachid. Likewise, a bore, a pit in the ground that's 4x4 wide, 10 deep, is considered a reshut yachid. And not only that, but imagine you go to the beach and you dig a ditch in a big hole at the beach. Normally, what do? You put all the sand that you dig on the sides of the pit, right, of your little your hole that you're digging. And you end up with walls that are higher than whatever, right, you dug deep. You now added walls. That's the chuliyah of the bore. It's the extra part of the dirt that you dug out. That adds to, so let's say your bore wasn't actually 10 deep. The fact that you now added a layer of dirt around the sides, that adds to the height of what you're trying to build. So that is mitzaref la'asara. V'amai, why should that count as part of your 10? And the truth is, many of the Mefarshim talk about not really your 10, but it's your 4. If it's 4x4 wide, and let's say down below it's not as much, right? That's going to make it considered 4x4 wide. So some people ask, why? Halo mishtamish le, right? You can't use that space for anything. It's empty space. It's not like a mound that can be used. You could put something on it. Here, it's empty space. Why is that counting for you? So Ella, ma'it lach lememar. So what can you say? The reason why this counts to be mashlim, your 4x4, this top part of the bore with the chuliyah, is demanach midi u'mishtamish, because you can put a board on top of there that's 4x4 wide, and then you can use that board. So that means that this is considered 4x4 wide because it's usable for you in some way. So what does this have to do with anything? We'll go back to our picture, 262, where we have a beam with yetedot all over it. Well, now we can say the same thing. Hachanami de manach midi umishtamish. You can put a board on top of those yitedot, and then you can use the space. So even though you haven't put a board, it's as if you put a board. This is usable to you. So as long as it's usable to you, we're going to say, here's a space of 4x4 tvachim that's usable to you. You see how they can view this like the chuliyah, like that extra part of the board, because it's kind of, here's your base, and then there's the extra, right? And the point is that if this is, you still have a space that you can put a board of 4x4 on top, that would allow it. So basically he says, yes, even if it's totally full of yitedot, I would still view this as a reshut yachid. Okay, that was all an aside to talk about cases where a reshut yachid can maybe be nim'at, limited in space. If the space is limited, then again, according to some of the opinions, it was limited. According to Rav Ashi, it wasn't limited, but then you would call it a makom p'tor. So again, it's these questions about limits. Or can you, even though it is 10 tall, can you say it's not really usable? Likewise, in our chatzir, even though it's 10 tall, you could say it doesn't function as a full-fledged mechitza because you can access the top, right? You can get there easily. So now we're back to our Eruv cases. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Just a quick second, I want to check the chat. Okay, the stakes are the same height. Right, so I see that, Caroline, you're pointing out that the stakes have to be the same height because otherwise you won't really be able to put a board on. So that would be another question, right? According to Rav Ashi, it sounds like if you're going to fill the whole thing with pegs, they're going to have to all be the same height. Otherwise, it really wouldn't work. Or maybe you would have to have a number of them at a particular height to basically allow something to be stable on top of them. Okay, moving to the next case. Amal Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Kotel asara tzarich sulam 14 lahatiro. Okay, for those who like math, we're back to mathematics. Okay, here I'm going to show you the picture, but I'm going to already tell you that I'm not going to explain it the way the picture has it. Okay, but the picture gives you an idea that what we're talking about here is how long your ladder, number one, how high your ladder needs to get to, and number two, how long your ladder needs to be, which is all an issue of the angles. Okay, now Rashi explains, and many people disagree with Rashi on this, and that's why I'm going to go with a different interpretation, that we're talking about that your ladder is 4 tvachim away from the wall. And then the question is how long it needs to be. And the problem is that the numbers really make no sense according to Rashi. And the numbers make the most sense mathematically if you say that the angle has to be 45 degrees. And that the whole idea here is, which we'll see later in the Gemara, they're going to talk about a sulam zakuf, right? A straight ladder. Generally, we don't climb up a straight ladder. It's not comfortable. It's not safe to climb up a straight ladder. So that ladder has to be angled. How much does it need to be angled? 45 degrees. Now imagine if you have an angled 45 degree, that means it's going to be at a right angle. That means it's going to be an isosceles triangle, which means that if it's 10 tvachim high, it's going to be 10 tvachim on the ground. And that must be the case. So these cases where it shows only jutting out 4 tvachim, imagine each one of these ladders that we're going to see in the picture are actually jutting out as high as they are. So they're going to be isosceles triangles and not the way they're done in this picture, okay? Because we're going to go by Tosfot and many others who understand it otherwise. Because again, Rashi, it's very hard to understand where he gets his numbers from. If you go by the other interpretation, it's very easy to understand the numbers other than one, which we're going to have a problem with. And Tosfot says it's a problem and it's not really the case, that number. So again, mathematics that sort of work out, but don't exactly work out. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, kotel asara, if your kotel is 10 tvachim high, tzarich sulam 14 lahatiro. Your ladder needs to be 14 tvachim long, which basically, if you make this isosceles triangle, so 10, 10, and what's the hypotenuse going to be of a 10, 10 triangle? It's going to be, comes out to 14.14. So 14 is close enough. We know the Gemara doesn't get into percentages, right, into decimals. So generally, sometimes they do, but not always. So we're going to say it's 14. So that makes perfect sense. If you want to have this right triangle, 10, 10, 14 will be the hypotenuse. But comes the second opinion, Rav Yosef Amar, afilu shlosha asar v'mashu, even 13 and a bit. Why 13 and a bit? So they explain that what he means is you don't need to get all the way up to 10. It's enough to call this accessible if you can get up to 9 and a bit. Because once you're at 9 and a bit, you're already almost at the top, right? If your ladder gets up to 9 and a bit, first of all, when you stand up, you're taller, right? You can obviously get over to the other side. It only needs to go up to 9 and a bit. That's already within 10 tvachim. This we see with people who wait into the 6th hour, right? They wait 5 hours in a minute, right? We often see this in halacha, that as long as you're in the 10th tefach, it's fine. So now do the math. 9, right? 9 squared plus 9 squared. And then you get the square root of that. I did all the mathematics just to double check. You get to 12.7. So 13 v'mashu makes sense. Also, remember, it's 9 v'mashu. So it's a little more than 9. Okay, I don't know why they say 13 v'mashu. It really should be about a little under 13. But okay, let's assume you added a little to the 9. And therefore, the number's a little bit higher. But anyway, it's around 13. That's close enough for us. Abai amar afilu 11 v'mashu. Now, how does he get to 11 v'mashu? And here's where the mathematical calculation doesn't really work. But the Gemara assumes what he means is you have to get to 7 and a bit. Why 7 and a bit? Because of our famous laws of Lavud. Once you're within 3 tvachim of the top, then you're already as if you're at the top. So therefore, you just have to get to within 3, less than 3. So that's 7 in a mashu. The problem is if you do 7, right, 49 plus 49, you do the square root of that, you get to 9.8. Now that's pretty far from 11 v'mashu. So already you're getting into a bit of a problem here. And Tosfot in Dibor Matchil Rav Yosef Amal, he actually says, Elanir Elari, if you look about 6 lines from the bottom, he was just trying to give an approximation and he didn't really mean this exact number. And he basically says, if you read at the bottom, the last line, second to last line, Ulabai v'mashu basarat tfachim pachot chomesh. He basically says exactly 9.8. Shehu alachson zayin al zayin. He basically changes the Gemara and he says it has to be 9.8 and not 11 because this 11 number doesn't make sense. Okay, so there's a bit of a problem how this 11 number got there in the first place. Maybe someone did the wrong calculation somehow, I don't know. Okay, so in any case, the main difference between the 3 of them is the height. How high does it have to be? And again, always assuming that we're talking about an isosceles triangle, and the whole point is they all think you need an angle of 45 degrees. And that's how they get to these measurements. So now, one other opinion. Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yoshua amar afilu shiva v'mashu. Okay, this is the first picture in the one all the way to the left, is even if you have one exactly 7 and mashu, meaning the ladder has to get up to 7 v'mashu. If your ladder is exactly 7 v'mashu, it's going to have to be straight up flush against the wall with no angle whatsoever. He thinks that that works, okay, other than all the other opinions that don't think so. So Amar Rav says, not exactly about, right? Rav says, Sulam zakuf mima'et. He says it's true. A sulam zakuf standing up actually does work to say that the top of the wall is accessible. Gemara v'lo yadana my time. It's a tradition that we have, and I don't really know why, because who climbs on a ladder like this? Look at that ladder, right? Who would climb on a ladder that's going straight up? There's no balance there, right? The whole ladder could just fall down. So now, Amar Shmuel v'lo yada Abba Tama. He calls often Rav Abba. It's a term of respect. Abba, don't you know? Daha miltan midi dahavia itztaba gabe itztaba. It's just like our case of the itztaba on top of the itztaba that we saw in yesterday's daf. In other words, there you had one itztaba that didn't have 4 tvachim. The one above it was within 3 tvachim and didn't also have 4 tvachim. I'm sorry, and had 4 tvachim. So we say that since you could get from one to the other, it works. So the whole issue here is since they could get from one to the other, it works. There you see people are climbing vertically without any sort of angle. So likewise here, you could say the same when it comes to the ladder. Okay. So, okay. So now we're going to say, sorry, I skipped a line. Okay, so that's the end of that section with the ladders. Now we're going to have other things, get back to like yesterday, things that basically are standing in your space that mean, remember we said it has to be not something that's movable or, right, it has to be something heavy and significant. So now we're going to see some examples of that. Remember we saw about the Sulam HaMitzri, the Sulam HaSuri. Now we're going to talk about stumps of trees in Bavel. Okay, apparently there were these tree stumps of palm trees in Bavel. Einam tzrichim keva, right? You can see they're all talking about the reality of their time. They don't need keva. They don't need to be there permanently, even if they are, even if they're not permanent. Then you still can say that this limits this kind of takes down the height, makes it more accessible. My taima, kvedan kovatan, the fact that they're so heavy means that you're not going to likely move it, right? You can imagine a tree stump would be pretty heavy. He says the ladders in Babylonia, again, this is like yesterday, the Sulam HaMitzri, the sulam atzuli, right? Those were the Tanaim we're talking about, because that's what was in their time period. But now we're moving to Emoraim, right? Where we're basically saying, oh, we have to talk about our reality. The ones in Babylonia are also heavy. So now they're going to compare these two statements and say, right, and here they say why? Because again, kvedan kova'atan. So manda amar sulamot koshkent kalin. If you say these ladders they had are considered keva because they're heavy and not movable, all the more so the tree stumps, because tree stumps are obviously heavier. Umanda amar kalim aval sulamot lo. But the one who said specifically the tree stumps is not going to agree when it comes to the sulamot, because the sulamot are lighter than tree stumps, so he might not necessarily agree that that's enough to be considered keva. Okay, before we move on, I just want to point out that there's a whole discussion going on in the chat about that at 45 degrees, it might be too great an angle and people might slip on that. So there's a good question about the reality of that and whether that's actually, true or not. Right, and also that there's an assumption that you're climbing by yourself and not that someone's necessarily holding it for you and keeping it stable for you. Again, you have to remember their ladders were clearly less stable than our ladders, I imagine. I mean, I'm sure they knew how to build things well, but I'm sure, we have better techniques, I assume, than they did. Okay. Rav Yosef meraba. Sulam mikan v'sulam mikan v'kashim be'emtza mahu. Our discussion now is going to veer to another issue relating to this, which is, in order for something to be accessible, we said, right, it has to diminish your height of 10, but it also, in order for it to be significant, we kept seeing this yesterday, it has to be 4 tvachim wide. So now we're going to have a question. What if the ladder is not 4 tvachim wide? Okay, look at the picture on the right here. So we have a ladder, 2 ladders next to each other. Each one is not 4 tvachim wide. We're going to read, let's just read first. Ba'amine Rav Yosef meraba. Sulam mikan besulam mikan bekashin be'emtza mahu. Okay, what if you have ropes in between? Okay, this reminds me, if you look at it like as a whole, those ropes that kids climb in the playground in the park, and they're made of ropes. So here it's kind of like that, where they have a crisscross, like things going vertically and horizontally. It kind of looks like that, but the difference is that here you have 2 very strong ones on the sides, each of your ladder, but there's straw, and these aren't ropes that are serious ropes. These are ropes made of straw in between, or not even, I don't even know if you call them ropes, but you put straw to connect in between. Now, what's the problem with this? You can't climb on straw. So the question is, if each of the rungs of the ladder are not 4 tvachim wide, and you have these ropes, these straw that connects between the rungs of the ladders, of the 2 ladders, do we consider that is what we call mashlim la'arba'ah? Again, it's all sorts of, taking these measurements. We don't exactly have what we want, but we can kind of add, or we have maybe too much, like with the height, and we can diminish. So here we say, does this help diminish the height? Do we say this ladder counts? So Amar le ein kaf haregel ola behen. No, you can't climb on this because you'll break the straw, and therefore, right, as soon as you climb, you'll fall right down. So therefore, it doesn't work. What if it's the reverse picture on the left? Kashin mikan v'kashin mikan v'sulam ba'emsa. Your ladder is in the middle. It doesn't have 4 by 4. It doesn't have 4 length of each of the rungs. But next to it are these straw ropes. So would that work? Amar le hare kaf haregel ola behen. This works. Now, why does this work? Because you don't really need 4 tvachim in order to climb. What you need the 4 tvachim is to have something to hold on to. Here you have the straw, that's strong enough to hold on to it. Okay, it would have to be solid straw. You can see it looks like solid straw. It's not super weak. You can't climb on it, but you could hold on to it. And therefore, since you could hold on to it, it works. I would question whether that's really true, because normally when you climb, you put a lot of pressure on, especially if you think of those ropes things that the kids climb on, right? If something's broken, it doesn't, something's not so strong, it's not so easy to hold on to it. But in any case, let's just assume that works. Now we're going to move to the next case. I'd like to tell you these kind of things, which is I'm showing you one explanation. There's many different explanations of what exactly the reality of this case is, because it doesn't tell you very much in the wording. Some people even think this doesn't even have to do with a ladder at all. There's no ladder in the picture. Some people think it does. Anyway, I'll go with the way our picture shows it. Chakak lahashlim bekotel bekama. Okay, we're now starting on the bet. What if, we're picture number 266, you take a ladder. The ladder is not 4 tvachim wide, but you make indentations in the wall. You carve into the wall space on the side of each of the rungs, And that gives you the support that you need. It's kind of like the ropes, right? The straw. And does it work? And the question is, it obviously works. The question is, how high do you need to do this? So the Gemara says, or he answers, right? Who asked who? We were still, Rav Yosef asked Rabbah. This is a slew of questions that Rav Yosef asked Rabbah. Again, all these questions have to do with, you don't have 4 tvachim of length and you want to extend it. So Amalei, ba'asara. It has to go up 10 tvachim high. Even if your wall is much higher, this basically means that your first 10 tefachim are accessible. And basically, we can assume that once you have the support, now again, logically, I'm not really sure why. Once you have the support of the first 10 tefachim, we assume you'll climb up to the top, which is kind of funny because when you get higher up, you're all the more cautious that you might fall, right? It's scarier and you would think you would need it all the way at the top. But he says, no, it's enough that you have 10 tefachim. Again, it's maybe symbolic of you have this 10 by 4. This is already something significant. And therefore, we view it as if you can get to the top without a problem. Amarle, so now he asks further. Hakiko kulo b'kotel b'kama. What if, picture number 267, instead of having a ladder, you didn't have a ladder. All you did was engrave these indentations into the wall and use that to climb all the way up. So he says, would that work? So Amarle, malo komato. This would work, but you have to get all the way up to the top. You can't have it that they're not 4 width all the way up to the top. They have to be 4 wide and they have to do all the way up to the top. Umay shna. So he says, what's the difference? Amarle, hata mistalekle, hachalo mistalekle. Again, this goes back to what a person would normally climb. It's not very comfortable to climb up when you have no ladder whatsoever and you just have indentations in the wall. Because of that, it has to be significant all the way up to the top. But if there's a ladder, then as long as we have the first 10 tefachim, then you're okay. Now we're moving a little bit off to a different area of this topic. Okay, we no longer have pictures here, so it's a little easier to visualize. So because of that, we can say it's okay. We can visualize without the pictures. Rav Yosef me Rabba. So again, Rav Yosef asked Rabba the following question. Asa oli ilan sulam mahu. What if you make a tree into a ladder? Okay, either it's already built like a ladder or you add some things into the tree. Now, what's the issue with a tree? We all know you can't use a tree on Shabbat. We've learned this a number of times. And in fact, I'll refresh your memory because we're going to make reference to this. There's a machloket Rebbe and the rabbis about Eruv Tchumin. Can you put your Eruv Tchumin on a tree? Rebbe says you can. Why? Because he says that, remember, the whole issue of not using a tree on Shabbat is Gzera midrabanan. It's only rabbinic. What's the concern? The concern is that you may use the tree and then, right, you're going to use it. And if you use it, right, you might climb up on it. You might break a branch or something, and that's a problem. So now, what did he say? Well, Eruv Tchumin only needs to be their ben hashmashot. If it only needs to be their ben hashmashot, there's no isurei shvut ben hashmashot. There's no isurim derabanan. The rabbis disagree with this and says, what do you mean? There are isurei derabanan. But if you hold there's no isurei derabanan during the shvut, meaning during ben hashmashot, during twilight, anything rabbinic prohibition is not relevant, then your Eruv Tchumin can be there all ben hashmashot without a problem. It can be accessible to you. Whole issue, remember, it was accessibility also there. It had to be accessible. If it's accessible, ben hashmashot, then it's fine. That's all you need. So the question is it going to be the same thing here? Tibai l'Rebbe v'tibai l'Rabbanan. So he says, I'm going to ask my question according to both. How so? Tibai l'Rebbe. I'm going to ask Rebbe the following question. As if Rebbe were here, I would ask according to his opinion. Ad kan lo kama Rabbi Hatam. Maybe he only says it there. Because kol davar shu mishum shvut lo gazru alav. Right? The whole reason is because they didn't make a gzera on any derabbanans. They didn't forbid anything rabbinic in nature. Ben hashmashot. Hanimile, but that's only ben hashmashot. Aval kule yoma lo. But kule yoma, the rest of the day, now Eruv Chatzerot has nothing to do with ben hashmashot. Eruv Chatzerot is, again, the question is, let's say we have a ladder that goes, we have a tree that goes between our two properties, right? Or it goes on my side, and maybe there's one on your side, and we can get from one to the other. Can we make an Eruv together? So the whole issue is, are we accessible one to the other? We have to be accessible all day. So therefore, this whole issue of ben hashmashot is irrelevant. O Dilma, or maybe he would say the other way. Afilu l'Rabbanan, who don't allow it by Eruv Tchumin, might say, Pitrahu va'aryehu de ravia aleh. What does that mean? he might say like this: when it comes to Erev Tchumen, you can't put it there because it's not accessible. It has to be accessible, bein hashmashot. But when it comes to Erev Chatzerot, what do we need? We don't need accessibility. We need to say, is there access between the two? Not necessarily on Shabbat. Is there access at all? That's when you want to be Konesh Shvita, it has to be accessible to you. Otherwise, you can't say, I'm living here. But if it's between our two Chatzerot, we want to say, are we considered one unit? Now, if you have an opening, which is a way to get there, an access way by this tree, but what's the problem? You can't use the tree on Shabbat. It's still a petach. It still means we have access. It's just that, and here they use a funny way of saying it, it's like there's a lion standing on top of it who's preventing you from getting there, which means there's some outside factor, which is Shabbat. The Isra of Shabbat is an outside factor that's saying, today you can't climb this tree. But normally it's accessible, which means we view this as if there's an opening between you. So therefore his question is according to both. Then he asks another question before we get an answer. What about Asa'ola Ashera Sulam? An Ashera is a tree that they use for idol worship. What if you made an Ashera tree a ladder? Now here we have an issue of what we call Isur Hana'ah. It's forbidden to benefit from anything that was used for idol worship. So Tibai le Rabbi Yehuda, Tibai le Rabbanan. Now we're going to get into a different machloket. If you remember, Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis had a machloket about using a grave. A grave is also forbidden to benefit from. Can you put the food for the Erev Tchumen on a grave? So Rabbi Yehuda said you can, because Erev Tchumen, if you remember, is only allowed for the purposes of a mitzvah, and therefore your benefit that you're getting from it is a mitzvah. And mitzvot lav lehenot nitnu. Mitzvot aren't considered benefit, and therefore you're not actually benefiting from the grave. And you also don't need the grave to watch over it, because as long as it's there ben hashmashot, after that, we don't really need it watched over. We don't care if something happens to it. The rabbis, on the other hand, say, no, this is benefit. You're getting benefit from it. You can't. So again, we would say maybe it breaks down to the same machloket here. Something that's forbidden b'hana'ah, can you do your Erev Chatzera? So again, he's going to ask according to both. Tibai le Rabbi Yehuda, because ad kan lo kam Rabbi Yehuda hatam demutar leknot bayit b'isurei hana'ah. There he says you can be konesh shvita with isurei hana'ah. Ela hatam debatar dekana le'eruv lo nichale delintar. But there, after you already acquired the eruv, you don't need it to be there anymore. But here, it's not the same thing. Here, you're getting personal benefit. The whole idea is personal benefit. This isn't for the sake of a mitzvah. It means we can carry from one to the other. So maybe he's only saying it there. O Dilma, or again, you could say the same thing about Rabbanit. Afilu l'Rabbanan pitchahu va'aryeh d'Reviale. You could say, according to the rabbis, this is accessible. There's a tree. It's true you can't use the tree, but that's for some reason that's not connected at all to our topic. There is a tree. Happens it's asur b'hana'ah, but that's like there's a lion on top telling you can't go, but really it's accessible. So let's see the answer. We're going to have a number of answers. So Rabbah says, Amrle ilan mutar va'ashera asur. The tree, right? You would have thought maybe he would say this. This would be the obvious because avodah zarah and getting benefit from avodah zarah for sure, right? Ashera, and Ashera is never accessible, right? To say it's a petach is very difficult because you can never climb on this tree. Whereas a regular tree, you can climb on during the week. So maybe you'd say that's a petach, but Ashera is not. But interestingly, Matkifla Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says, Adrabah, it should be the reverse. Why? Ilan she'isur Shabbat gorem lo nitzah. Ashera she'isur davar acher gorem lo nitzah. He says something very interesting. He says, maybe you would say specifically, the one that relates to an isur Shabbat. The tree you can't use on Shabbat. That's related. If you want to use this concept of it's like there's a lion on top, that means there's some external issue that has nothing to do with it. That you could say when it comes to Ashera, it's some other entirely completely different issue, avodah zarah, which has nothing to do with it. But when it's a Shabbat issue, you can't climb the tree because it's Shabbat, and we're talking about allowing it on Shabbat, that we're not going to allow. So he says the exact reverse. Now, there's an obvious question here. I don't know if you thought about it, but if you say that a regular tree is forbidden, but an Ashera tree is allowed, and why is a regular tree forbidden? Because you might climb on it. Well, an Ashera tree, you also might climb on it. So an Ashera tree should be forbidden because it's a tree. Maybe not because it's avodah zarah, but because it's a tree. So the Ritva says it must be that the tree is detached. It was something that was a detached tree that had been used for idol worship, and it's detached, or it doesn't have any branches or anything. And it would have to be some situation where the tree doesn't have any of those issues. And in fact, Itmar Nami, to support Rav Chisda, they bring another person who says the same thing he says. Ki ata Ravin amar Rabbi Elazar, va'amar la Rabbi Abau, amar Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, either it was said the name of Rabbi Yochanan or the name of Rabbi Elazar, both from Israel. Kol she'isur Shabbat garam lo, asul. Kol she'isur davar acher garam lo, mutal. It would have to be the Isurei Shabbat is what's forbidding you and not something else. So if it's Shabbat, then we already can't look at that as some external factor. If it's something that is Shabbat related, then it's a problem. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, I'm not sure if I just said something opposite, but you understand. It's either Shabbat and then it's a problem, or it's not Shabbat and then it's not a problem. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak ma'nehachi, he has a totally different, right? We saw one approach that Avodah Zarah is a problem because it's Avodah Zarah. Shabbat, right? It's only Asher D'Rabbanan, not a problem. We saw the reverse. Shabbat, it has to do with Shabbat, so because of that, it's a problem. And the other one, right, would say not. And now we can have a third. Ilan plugta de Rabbi v'Rabbanan, Asherah plugta de Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanan. In fact, it does break down to those original machlokot. Okay, he doesn't actually paskin based on this, but I guess however you paskin there, you paskin here. But he says it's exactly the same. We tried to distinguish. He says no, it's exactly the same. One of the issues about this, and I don't want to get into all the details of how you read each one according to him, but you would have to say that when it comes to Rabbi Yehuda, if you remember, we had a whole discussion about him. Is it because mitzvot lav le'not and all that? You'd have to say that the conclusion of that sugya Rav Nachman doesn't agree with. Because if Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak agreed with that, he wouldn't be able to say this, because then it's clearly only a tchumen issue, because it has to do with it's for the purposes of a mitzvah, mitzvot lav le'not. He would have to understand Rabbi Yehuda the way they originally understood, which is it's a sor b'hana'ah, because it's a sor b'hana'ah, you can't, you would have to say that this somehow it's the same thing for Eruv, basically. Let me just check my notes because I wrote this down. 1 second. Right, you would have to say that it's not only lidvar mitzvah, and that he views that even so, he said, right, he says you can use it. That's not in Eruv Chatzerot. It would be the same as an Eruv Tchumen, and it's not considered really benefit. You'd have to say neither of them are really considered benefit, but not because it's Tzorch Mitzvah. You'd have to say this just isn't benefit somehow, or you'd have to come up with some explanation. It's hard according to the Pshat, certainly the way we concluded there. Okay, moving on to the next Mishnah. Charitz shebein shtei chatzerot. We're again moving back to two courtyards, and there's something in between them that separates them. So we started last time with a wall that's 10 tefachim high, 4 tefachim wide, where we said either, right, they can only make separate Eruvs. They can't make an Eruv together because there's a wall, a big Rishut Yachid in the middle. So likewise, the charitz shebein shtei chatzerot, amok 10 v'rochav 4. Likewise, if you have the opposite, you have a ditch, which is 10 deep, 4 wide, Ma'arvin shnayim ve'ein ma'arvin echad. Same thing. They can't make an Eruv together. They can only make separate Eruvs. Afilu malei kasho tevin. Even if you filled up the hole, if you fill up the hole with straw, then it doesn't help you. Malei afal o tzrorot. But if you filled it with dirt or rocks, pebbles, ma'arvin echad ve'ein ma'arvin shnayim. Then we view those. Now, what's the difference? Because straw is very easy to move, right? You're not going to necessarily leave it there for long term. But once you have something heavy there, it's hard to move. Again, it's kind of like before we talked about something heavy. We're not going to move it. Then already it will fill it in. If it's filled in, then actually we go to the reverse case. Then we say you can't make a separate Eruv because there's no wall here. There's no barrier at all. You filled it in. So now we're all one unit and you have to make an Eruv together. And if you don't make an Eruv together, nobody can carry anywhere. Natan alav neser. What if you put like a wood beam? Okay, here we're going to talk about, we'll see the picture. You have 2 chatzerot with a ditch, but you put a beam across so you can walk across through that beam. Again, it's accessible. So then, or you have 2 porches opposite each other. Some people say with a reshut or a beam in the middle, some people say you're on 2 sides of a street. Some people say you're on one side of the same street, but there's, part of the reshut or a beam goes through. So in this case, marvin shnayim v'martzu marvin echad. It could go either way. Okay, as long as it's 4 wide, this bridge that you build from one porch to the other, or from one side of the ditch to the other, if it's significant, then it allows you to choose what you want to do, either separate or together. Pachot mikam, but if it's less than 4, marvin shnayim ve'ein marvin echad, then you can only, if it's less than 4, then we don't consider this accessible, and you can only make your own Eruv. Now the Gemara is going to ask, the teven lo chayitz, why do you say the teven would not create a chatzitza, like a barrier between our two courtyards, and you should be able to carry? V'hanan tnan, it says in the Mishnah, further on in Eruvin, matbein, which is a pile of straw, shebein shtei chatzerot, or hay, shebein shtei chatzerot, gavoa 10 tvachim, marbin shnayim ve'em marbin echad. If you have a pile of this hay in between our two courtyards, and it's 10 high, 4 wide, then that's considered a wall. So if it's considered a wall, why wouldn't it be considered that it could fill up this ditch? So Amar Abaye, when it comes to, if you put up a big pile, that's going to be called a separation. But in terms of filling in this ditch, it's only if you said, I'm leaving this here for the long term, or at least for all of Shabbat. But if you didn't, now there's a whole debate, like always, do you have to say, or is it enough that you have in mind? Okay, and where we draw the line there, that's a whole separate question. But as long as you have intent, or you say that you intend to leave it there, then we can say it's fine. But if you didn't, we're assuming you're going to move it. So they distinguish here. If you built a huge pile of it, we're going to assume that you meant it to stay. But if you filled a ditch in with it, then we're not sure. Okay, why exactly it's different is a good question, but there seems to be an assumption made about people's behavior. What if somebody fills a ditch with it, they're likely to move it. Whereas if they built a tall, something out of it, then it's more likely to count as a mechitza. Okay, we'll end here for today and move on to more things about this Mishnah tomorrow. Have a good day, everybody.